The moment Ryan saw the photograph, all the color left his face. Not slowly. Not like surprise. Like recognition. He stood in my kitchen with his keys still in one hand, his work bag slipping from his shoulder, staring at the open briefcase on my counter. Cash sat inside in neat wrapped stacks. Beside it were photographs I had never seen before. My ex-husband with Ryan outside a downtown hotel. My ex-husband with Ryan in the parking lot of a private club. My ex-husband with Ryan behind the courthouse the week our divorce was finalized. Ryan didn't ask where I got them. He didn't ask why the briefcase was open. He only whispered one sentence. "Claire, don't call anyone yet." That was when I understood. Whatever had happened to my missing ex-husband had already walked into my house. 6 hours earlier, I was folding laundry in the same kitchen, trying to pretend the evening was ordinary. The house was quiet in that strange way it gets after a child becomes a teenager. Not empty exactly, just emotionally unavailable. My son Ben was upstairs with his headphones on, probably pretending homework didn't exist. Ryan had texted that he would be late from work. And my ex-husband Richard had been missing since noon. His sister called first. Then his office manager. Then one of his old golf friends, which somehow made it feel more serious. Richard never missed a tea time. He might miss a parent-teacher conference. He might miss a birthday dinner. But he never missed an appointment that mattered to men in polo shirts. By 7:30, I had spoken to 2 police officers and one very nervous receptionist from his investment office. Everyone used careful words. No one said vanished. No one said danger. They said no confirmed location. They said routine follow-up. They said adults have the right to leave voluntarily. I understood what they meant. Richard was wealthy enough to disappear inconveniently without anyone panicking too fast. That had always been part of his power. Even absence looked respectable when it wore the right last name. I was placing Ben's folded sweatshirt on the stairs when the doorbell rang. One short chime. Then nothing. I checked the peephole. No one stood outside. Just the porch light falling across the welcome mat and the boxwood shrubs Ryan kept saying we needed to trim. I opened the door with my phone already in my hand. The briefcase sat directly in front of me. Black leather. Silver locks. No note. No delivery label. For a few seconds I simply stared. Then I looked toward the street. Our neighborhood in Westerville looked exactly like a brochure for calm living. 2-car garages, basketball hoops, porch flags, SUVs under soft yellow lights. Nothing moved except a dog walker at the corner. I brought the briefcase inside without calling out to Ben. That was my first mistake. Or maybe it was my first honest instinct. Some part of me already knew this belonged to an adult secret. And adult secrets had shaped my life for years. The locks were old-fashioned combination dials. 3 digits each. I almost laughed when I saw them. Richard used the same 4 numbers for everything. Our anniversary. Not because he was sentimental. Because he disliked remembering anything that didn't benefit him. I tried the month and day. Nothing. Then I tried Ben's birthday. The left lock clicked. That made my stomach tighten. The right lock took longer. I stood there in my kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum, trying dates from a marriage I had worked hard to survive. Richard's birthday. His mother's birthday. The day his father died. Nothing. Then I tried the year Ben was born. Click. The sound was small. The room changed anyway. Inside was cash. Not loose. Not messy. Organized into bank straps stacked beside a manila envelope and a small flash drive. I didn't touch the money at first. Money had always been Richard's language. Control disguised as care. He paid for things instead of apologizing. He bought Ben expensive gifts after missing weekends. He sent checks on time and affection late, if at all. That was one reason people respected him. A man who pays is rarely questioned by people who benefit from his image. I opened the envelope. The first photograph showed Richard standing beside Ryan. My current boyfriend. My quiet, reliable Ryan. The man who remembered how I took coffee. The man who fixed the loose railing without mentioning it. The man who never pushed me to talk about my divorce but always looked relieved when I didn't. They were outside the Monarch Hotel downtown. Richard wore a gray suit. Ryan wore the brown jacket I bought him last Christmas. They weren't shaking hands. They were arguing. Richard's mouth was half open. Ryan's hand was raised palm down like he was telling him to lower his voice. I turned over the photograph. No writing. Only a timestamp printed in the corner. 3 months before Richard disappeared. I picked up the next one. Same 2 men. Different location. A private country club across town where Richard used to take clients and pretend golf was a business skill. Then another. Courthouse parking lot. The week our divorce became final. My fingers went cold. I sat down slowly at the kitchen island. For 2 years I had believed Richard and Ryan existed in separate chapters of my life. Richard was the closed door. Ryan was the careful beginning. Now the photographs placed them in the same room long before I ever knew they had spoken. I heard Ben's door open upstairs. Mom. I snapped the envelope closed too quickly. He appeared halfway down the stairs, tall and thin, wearing pajama pants and one of Richard's old college sweatshirts. That sweatshirt always bothered me. I never said so. What was that, he asked? Nothing. He looked at the briefcase. Teenagers know lies by rhythm. Not content. Is that Dad's? I paused half a second too long. I don't know. His eyes moved to the cash before I could close the lid. His face changed. Not fear. Something worse. Adult awareness arriving too early. Did something happen to him? I wanted to say no. I wanted to say go upstairs. I wanted to wrap the whole ugly thing in the same protective silence adults used when they were really protecting themselves. Instead, I said I'm trying to find out. Ben stood there another moment. Then nodded once. Not trusting me. Just accepting there would be no real answer yet. He went upstairs quietly. That hurt more than if he had slammed the door. I looked back at the photographs. Then at the flash drive. Then at my phone. I should have called the police. Maybe I should have called my lawyer. Instead, I called Ryan. He didn't answer. That was unusual. Ryan always answered, even if only to say he couldn't talk. I left no message. 20 minutes later, I heard his car in the driveway. The garage door opened. His footsteps entered through the mudroom. Slow. Normal? Domestic. For one brief second, I almost closed the briefcase. Not to protect him. To protect the version of my life where he was still safe. But the lid stayed open. Ryan walked into the kitchen. He saw my face first. Then the cash. Then the photos. And then he stopped breathing normally. That was the part I noticed. Not his silence. His breath. A small interruption in the body before the mind invents words. Ryan, I said. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on the photograph of him and Richard outside the courthouse. Why is your face like that? He swallowed. Once. Twice. Then he reached toward the briefcase and stopped himself halfway. That small movement told me more than any confession could have. He knew what it was. He knew why it was here. And he knew I was not supposed to see it. Ryan didn't touch the briefcase. That became important later. At the time, I only noticed because he normally touched everything in my kitchen automatically. Coffee mugs, countertops, my shoulder when he walked past me. Small domestic habits. Proof of comfort. Now his hands stayed stiff at his sides. Ben's footsteps moved upstairs above us. A bedroom door closed softly. Ryan finally looked at me. Not guilty. Calculating. That frightened me more. How long have you known Richard? I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. A while. A while. I repeated it slowly because middle-aged women learn to hear avoidance inside simple words. How long is a while? Ryan exhaled through his nose. Before you and I started dating. The room went quiet except for the dishwasher humming behind us. I stared at him. You knew my ex-husband before you met me? Yes. And somehow never mentioned that. He rubbed one hand against the back of his neck. It wasn't like we were friends. I picked up one of the photographs. You look pretty friendly standing outside hotels together. That's not what it looks like. People always say that before explaining exactly what it looks like. I didn't answer. Ryan finally moved toward the counter slowly. Carefully. Like sudden movements might damage something fragile. Claire Richard was in trouble. What kind of trouble? He hesitated. Financial. That surprised me less than it should have. Richard built his identity around stability, expensive stability, golf memberships, retirement seminars, steakhouse dinners with clients who wore watches heavier than my monthly grocery budget. Men like Richard rarely admitted weakness until collapse became visible from space. How much trouble? Ryan looked toward the stairs instinctively. Ben. Always Ben. That alone told me the number was large. A lot. I laughed once under my breath. Not because it was funny, because suddenly dozens of disconnected memories began organizing themselves. Richard selling the lake boat unexpectedly last spring. Richard borrowing money from his sister temporarily. Richard becoming obsessed with cryptocurrency podcasts despite barely understanding email attachments. Midlife panic wearing the costume of investment strategy. I folded my arms. So why are there photographs of you with him? Ryan stayed quiet too long. Ryan. I was helping him. With what? Another pause. Then finally. Moving money. I stared at him. The words sat there between us like a smell. Not dramatic. Just contaminating. What does that mean? It means he was trying to keep certain assets protected. Protected from who? His eyes met mine carefully. The divorce. I actually felt my body pull backward slightly. Physical reaction before emotion caught up. You helped my ex-husband hide money from me. Ryan looked exhausted suddenly. Not exactly. That sounds exactly correct, actually. He looked away. Which told me enough. I picked up the photograph again. The courthouse parking lot. Same week the divorce finalized. Same week Richard insisted his retirement accounts were struggling. Same week I agreed to less alimony because Ben needed emotional peace more than courtroom warfare. I sat down slowly. Not because I felt weak. Because anger at 47 feels different than anger at 27. Less explosive. More surgical. You knew, I said quietly. Ryan rubbed both hands together once. I knew he was trying to avoid financial exposure. And you helped him. He said you'd destroy him. That almost made me laugh again. Richard always believed consequences were destruction. Especially consequences that applied to him. I looked toward the staircase. Did my son know? Ryan answered immediately. No. Too quickly. That answer bothered me too. Not because I thought Ben knew. Because Ryan sounded relieved by the question. Relief reveals priorities. I stood and walked toward the sink. Outside the kitchen window, snow drifted lightly across the neighbor's lawn. Mr. Garrison across the street was dragging his trash bins toward the curb in sweatpants and loafers. Ordinary suburbia continuing on schedule. Meanwhile, my life had quietly become evidence. Did Richard send this? I asked. I don't know. You don't know. Ryan's voice lowered. I swear to you, Claire, I haven't spoken to him since Tuesday. Today was Friday. That timeline sat badly in my chest. Why was he meeting you behind my back? Ryan leaned against the counter carefully. Because he trusted me. That answer landed harder than he intended. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. Richard trusted Ryan more than he trusted me. Men often trust each other with the truth while giving women curated versions designed to preserve emotional stability. I had lived inside that dynamic for 23 years without naming it properly. I opened the briefcase again. Cash. Photos. Flash drive. I picked up the drive between two fingers. What's on this? Ryan's expression changed instantly. Fear this time. Real fear. Claire. What's on it? I don't think you should watch it tonight. Interesting. Not you shouldn't watch it. Not it's private. Tonight. Meaning eventually he expected me to see it. Just not before he controlled the context. That realization sharpened something inside me immediately. I'll decide that myself. Ryan stepped forward. Not aggressive. But enough to make me aware of the distance between us shrinking. Richard wasn't trying to hurt you. I looked at him carefully. You know what's strange? He said nothing. I don't think either of you actually understand when you're hurting women. That landed. I saw it land. Ryan looked genuinely wounded by the sentence. Good. Some truths should wound before they educate. Upstairs, Ben's floor creaked softly. Listening. Of course he was listening. Children in emotionally tense homes become experts in acoustic psychology. Ryan lowered his voice even further. Your son doesn't need this. My son already has this. I gestured toward the briefcase. The only question is whether adults keep lying around him. Ryan pressed his lips together tightly. I suddenly remembered something Richard used to say during our marriage whenever conflict became inconvenient. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. At the time, I thought that sounded mature. Now I understood it differently. Translation. Please keep your emotional reaction small enough for my comfort. I looked at Ryan again. What exactly was your relationship with Richard? Business. Only business. Another pause. Then, mostly. That word settled into the room slowly. Mostly. Not enough for certainty. Too much for innocence. I picked up the flash drive. Ryan's eyes followed the movement immediately. You really don't want me watching this? He didn't answer. That was answer enough. Ben suddenly appeared at the edge of the kitchen doorway. Neither of us heard him come downstairs. Teenagers move quietly when emotional weather changes inside a house. He looked from me to Ryan, then to the open briefcase. Is Dad in trouble? No one answered fast enough. Ben nodded once slowly. Again that same expression. Adult awareness arriving too early. I heard people at school talking today, he said quietly. My stomach tightened. What people? They said the FBI was at Dad's office. Ryan looked down immediately. Interesting. Ben noticed too. Children notice where adults place their eyes during uncomfortable truths. That true, Ben asked. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Ryan spoke instead. Your dad made some mistakes. Ben stared at him. Not emotional. Evaluating. What kind of mistakes? Ryan hesitated. Too long again. Then Ben looked at me instead. That hurt. Because I realized in that moment my son no longer trusted adults to tell the same version of reality. And maybe he never really had. I'm going upstairs, he said quietly. Ben. But he was already turning away. Not angry. Worse. Withdrawn. The same emotional survival skill Richard perfected decades earlier. I waited until I heard Ben's door close upstairs. Then I looked back at Ryan. You need to leave. His face tightened. Claire, you helped my ex-husband lie to me during the divorce. It wasn't that simple. No, I said softly. It was probably simpler. Ryan stood motionless for several seconds, then finally picked up his keys. At the doorway, he stopped without turning around. If you watch the drive, he said quietly, watch it alone. That sentence stayed with me long after the front door closed behind him. Because suddenly I knew something worse than betrayal was waiting inside that little piece of plastic. Perspective. I waited until midnight to watch the flash drive. Not because I was afraid of what it contained. Because I needed the house to feel asleep first. Ben's bedroom light finally turned off around 11:30. I heard his bathroom sink run once, then silence settled across the second floor. The kind of silence suburban homes specialize in. Layered. Controlled. Full of things people choose not to say through walls. I carried my laptop into the dining room instead of the kitchen. The kitchen still smelled like Ryan's cologne. I didn't want that smell near me while I watched. The flash drive contained only 4 video files. No labels. No dates. Just numbered clips. My hand hovered over the mouse longer than I expected. Then I opened the first one. Security footage. Black and white. No audio. Richard sat across from Ryan inside what looked like a hotel conference room. A small round table separated them. Richard leaned forward constantly while speaking. Ryan barely moved. Even silent, their dynamic felt familiar. One man desperate to control a situation. The other trying not to absorb panic. I watched Richard slide an envelope across the table. Ryan pushed it back. Richard pushed harder. Then Ryan finally took it. My chest tightened. The timestamp showed 6 months before our divorce finalized. I opened the second file immediately. Different location. Parking garage. This one had audio, though faint. Richard stood beside his BMW, speaking too quickly. Ryan kept glancing around the garage. You said nobody else knew, Ryan said. No one does. That's not the point. It's temporary. Richard laughed nervously after saying it. I knew that laugh. I heard it during our marriage whenever he wanted reality to feel negotiable. Temporary debt. Temporary stress. Temporary distance. Men like Richard always believed consequences arrived for other people first. Then Ryan asked the question that changed everything. What about Claire? Richard's face hardened instantly. She doesn't need details. Not she deserves protection. Not I'm trying to help her. Just she doesn't need details. I paused the video. That sentence crawled under my skin slowly. For 23 years, Richard treated emotional information like classified material. He believed withholding truth was responsibility. And too often I accepted it because calmness looked mature from the outside. I resumed the video. Ryan crossed his arms. She's still Ben's mother. And I'm still handling it. Ryan looked unconvinced. Good. At least one man in the footage still recognized I existed. The third file opened on what looked like a country club patio. Late afternoon sunlight. Richard without a tie. Ryan drinking coffee. The footage quality looked clearer here, almost professionally recorded. That bothered me immediately. Who records conversations at a country club? Richard looked exhausted. Older than I remembered him seeming during those years. You're making this emotional, he said. Ryan stared at him. It already is emotional. No, Richard shook his head impatiently. It's financial. That line almost made me laugh. Of course he believed those were separate categories. Ryan leaned closer across the table. She's going to find out eventually. Richard's expression changed then. Subtle, but unmistakable. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of exposure. Of humiliation. Of appearing weak. I can't let her see me fail, he said quietly. That sentence stayed in the room after the video ended. I sat frozen in my dining chair staring at my own reflection in the dark laptop screen. Not because I pitied him. Because suddenly I understood him more clearly than I wanted to. Richard didn't hide financial problems because he enjoyed deception. He hid them because status was the only language he trusted. Failure threatened his entire identity. And people built entirely on external respect become dangerous when embarrassment enters the room. I rubbed my forehead slowly, then opened the final file. This one began abruptly. Phone camera footage. Shaky. Nighttime. Richard stood near the riverfront downtown wearing the same gray coat he wore to Ben's school orchestra concert last winter. He looked directly into the camera. At me. My stomach tightened immediately. Claire, he said. His voice sounded tired. Not performative tired. Real tired. If you're watching this, something probably went wrong. I leaned closer unconsciously. Behind him, river lights reflected across black water. I know how this looks. A humorless smile crossed his face. No, actually, I don't. He looked away briefly. Then back. Ryan thinks I should tell you everything. That surprised me instantly. Not because Ryan defended me. Because Richard admitted it aloud. He still believes honesty fixes things. A long pause followed. Richard rubbed one hand over his mouth slowly. I used to believe stability mattered more than honesty. That sentence sounded painfully sincere. And maybe when Ben was little it did. He inhaled sharply through his nose. But somewhere along the way I stopped protecting the family and started protecting myself. I didn't move. Didn't blink. The emotional weight of hearing accountability from Richard felt physically strange. Like wearing someone else's glasses. You deserved more truth than I gave you. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Not forgiveness. Not softness. Just recognition. Which somehow hurt worse. Richard looked off camera briefly, then lowered his voice. There are things Ryan still doesn't know. That got my attention immediately. You should be careful who you trust after this. A cold feeling moved through my stomach. What does that mean? I whispered at the screen. Richard continued before I could think further. If anything happens to me, it won't be random. I sat straighter. Behind him, a car passed somewhere nearby. Headlights briefly crossed his face. I made mistakes with money. A bitter laugh escaped him. More than mistakes. He looked exhausted now. Old. For the first time in my life, Richard looked like a man instead of a role. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. "There are people involved who care more about reputation than prison." I froze. Not because it sounded dramatic, because it sounded believable. Middle-class America runs quietly on reputation. Church reputations, business reputations, country club reputations, marriage reputations. People destroy evidence faster than image. Richard looked directly into the camera again. "If Ryan brought this to you himself, trust him." My pulse slowed slightly. "But if someone else did?" He stopped talking. A long silence filled the recording. Then I waited too long. The video ended abruptly. No explanation. No names. No closure. Just darkness. I sat alone at the dining table for several minutes without moving. The heating system clicked softly somewhere inside the walls. Outside, snow tapped against the windows. I replayed the sentence again in my head. "If Ryan brought this to you himself, trust him." But he hadn't. Someone else left the briefcase at my door. That changed everything. I suddenly remembered Ryan's face when he entered the kitchen earlier. Not only fear, confusion. As if the briefcase appearing at my house disrupted some larger plan. I looked down at the photographs spread across the table. Then at Richard frozen on the laptop screen. For years I believed my marriage ended because love faded naturally. Now I wasn't even sure the divorce had belonged entirely to us. Maybe powerful men had been rearranging my life quietly behind closed doors long before I noticed. I heard a soft creak upstairs. Ben. Awake. Listening again. I closed the laptop gently. Then I noticed something strange. One photograph was missing from the table. The courthouse picture. Ryan and Richard outside the courthouse. Gone. I stared at the empty space for several seconds before standing up slowly. And for the first time that night I locked my front door. The courthouse photograph was sitting on Ben's desk. I found it the next morning beside his math homework and an empty cereal bowl. Sunlight came through the blinds in thin gray lines across the room. Ben sat in his desk chair wearing headphones around his neck, staring at the picture like it contained answers adults forgot to explain. He didn't look guilty for taking it. Just thoughtful. That frightened me more. "You should have asked," I said quietly. Ben looked up. "You would have said no." Fair point. I stepped farther into the room slowly. Clothes on the floor. Basketball posters. A half-built model car gathering dust near the bookshelf. Childhood lingering at the edges while adulthood pushed through too early. Ben tapped the corner of the photograph. "Why was Dad with Ryan at the courthouse?" I stayed silent too long. Again. Teenagers measure truth in hesitation. "I'm still figuring that out," I said carefully. Ben leaned back in his chair. "That means yes." I rubbed my forehead. "You shouldn't have to deal with this." "But I am." There it was. Simple. Direct. More emotionally honest than most adults I knew. I sat on the edge of his bed. "When your father and I divorced, there were financial things happening I didn't fully understand." Ben looked down at the photo again. "Did Ryan help him?" "Yes. Against you." The fact he understood the emotional structure immediately made my chest ache. Maybe I admitted. Ben nodded once slowly. Not shocked. Almost disappointed in advance. Like trust failing no longer surprised him. That realization hit harder than anything Richard left inside the briefcase. "Did Dad steal money?" he asked quietly. "No." I paused. "At least I don't think so." "You don't sound sure." "Because I wasn't." That was the problem. Richard spent decades building certainty as performance. Now every memory felt unstable. Ben looked toward the window. "People online are saying the FBI raided his office." I closed my eyes briefly. Of course they were. Small-town Ohio professionals spend half their lives managing appearance, and the other half gossiping about collapsed appearances. "Don't read comments," I said. Ben gave me a tired look beyond his years. "I'm 15, Mom." "Right. Too old for protection. Too young for this." Downstairs, my phone started vibrating against the kitchen counter. Unknown number. I ignored it. Then it rang again immediately. And again. Ben noticed my expression. "You should answer." I walked downstairs with the phone still buzzing in my hand. Unknown caller again. This time I picked up. Claire Whitmore. Female voice. Professional. Controlled. Yes. This is Special Agent Dana Keller with the Columbus Field Office. We need to speak with you regarding Richard Whitmore. My stomach tightened instantly. Not panic. Recognition. The vague fear finally becoming official. I already spoke with local police. This is separate. I looked toward the staircase instinctively. Ben stood halfway down listening. Of course he was. We'd prefer to speak in person, she continued. When? Today. 3 hours later, I sat inside a federal office building downtown holding paper coffee I had no intention of drinking. Agent Keller looked younger than I expected. 40s maybe. Minimal makeup. Navy blazer. The kind of calm competence that made emotional people confess too much around her. Another agent sat beside her silently taking notes. I suddenly understood why Richard feared rooms like this. Not because of prison. Because these people didn't care about reputation. Keller folded her hands carefully. When was the last time you spoke with your ex-husband? Tuesday evening. And your current partner, Ryan Mercer? The phrasing bothered me immediately. Current partner. Clinical language removing intimacy from the situation. Yesterday? Did he mention Richard's financial activities? I hesitated. Keller noticed. Professionals like her always notice. Mrs. Whitmore, she said gently, your ex-husband may have been involved in large-scale financial concealment. Concealment. Another careful word. Not fraud. Not theft. American institutions love vocabulary that sounds expensive. He hid assets during our divorce, I said quietly. The room shifted slightly after I said it aloud. Real. Documented. Keller exchanged a quick glance with the other agent. You recently received materials connected to Mr. Whitmore. There it was. The briefcase. They already knew. I sat straighter. How do you know about that? We're asking the questions today. Not rude. Just controlled. Power rarely raises its voice. I looked at the untouched coffee cup between my hands. What exactly did Richard do? Keller considered me carefully before answering. He created private investment channels using associates and intermediary accounts. Associates? My mind immediately went to Ryan. He believed exposure would destroy his public standing, she added. That sounded painfully accurate. The other agent finally spoke. We also believe someone close to him began leveraging that information financially. I looked up sharply. Leveraging. Blackmail, Keller translated calmly. The room went cold around me. Not because it shocked me. Because suddenly Ryan's fear inside my kitchen made sense differently. Not guilt alone. Fear. Real fear. I thought about the videos again. Ryan pushing envelopes back. Ryan telling Richard to tell me the truth. Ryan warning him. That didn't feel like blackmail. But maybe I only wanted it not to. Keller slid a printed photograph across the table. My stomach dropped. Ryan. Leaving Richard's office building 3 nights before he disappeared. Time stamped. Clear. He says they met to settle a debt, Keller said. Did they? I don't know. That answer sounded weak even to me. Keller studied my face quietly. Then her tone softened slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, your ex-husband, emptied several accounts before disappearing. I stared at her. Disappearing. Interesting choice. Not missing. Not endangered. Intentional language. You think he ran. We think he was afraid. That felt true. Richard feared humiliation more than consequences. More than loneliness. Possibly more than losing his family. Keller leaned slightly forward. Fear makes respectable men unpredictable. That line stayed with me. Because middle-class American masculinity often depends on appearing emotionally invulnerable. The moment public weakness arrives, some men implode trying to outrun shame. I left the building just before sunset. Downtown Columbus looked painfully ordinary. Office workers carrying laptops, couples leaving restaurants, valet attendants jogging through traffic. Meanwhile, my entire adult life had quietly transformed into evidence folders. Ryan was sitting inside my driveway when I got home. Engine off. Hands gripping the steering wheel. He looked exhausted. Older. I stayed inside my car for several seconds before getting out. Ryan stepped onto the driveway slowly. We need to talk. I almost laughed. Men always say that after detonating trust. What did the FBI ask you? I said instead. His expression tightened immediately. So they had contacted him too. Interesting. Ryan rubbed one hand over his face. Claire, there are things you still don't understand. I understand you lied to me. It started before you and I were serious. Not the point. He looked away. Then finally said the sentence I had been unconsciously fearing all day. Richard thought someone was setting him up. Cold moved slowly through my chest. Who? Ryan swallowed. I think it was someone from his own firm. I stared at him. You knew this before he disappeared. Yes. And you still didn't tell me. Ryan's voice lowered. He made me promise. That sentence nearly broke something in me. Not because of Richard. Because Ryan still sounded loyal to him. More loyal than honest with me. Ben opened the front door then. Neither of us realized he'd been standing inside listening. His eyes moved between us slowly. Tired. Careful. Adult again. Did Dad run away? He asked quietly. No one answered immediately. And in that silence, my son finally understood what kind of men had raised him. Ben stopped asking about his father after that night. That worried me more than anger would have. Anger is still attachment. Silence is retreat. Over the next week, he moved through the house carefully. Too carefully. He closed cabinets softly, ate dinner quickly, stayed in his room longer than usual. Ryan texted every day. I answered none of them. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I no longer knew which version of him was real. The man who brought me soup when I had the flu. Or the man helping my ex-husband move hidden money while sitting across from me at dinner pretending normal life still existed. Maybe both. That was the uncomfortable part. Adults rarely become villains all at once. Most damage arrives through compartmentalization. Friday afternoon, I drove to Lancaster to meet one of Richard's former business associates. Harold Bennett. 72. Semi-retired. Still wearing expensive loafers despite having nowhere urgent left to go. We met inside a nearly empty country club restaurant overlooking a gray golf course dusted with late winter frost. Harold ordered iced tea. People like him drank cold drinks year-round to prove weather did not inconvenience them. He studied me carefully across the table. You look tired. My ex-husband disappeared. He nodded once. Fair enough. No dramatic sympathy. Just acknowledgement. That felt more honest. Harold folded his napkin carefully before speaking again. Richard was unraveling long before anyone noticed. I leaned back slowly. What happened? Harold looked out toward the golf course. Shame. I almost laughed. Not because it sounded wrong, because it sounded too small for the amount of destruction surrounding us. He lost money, Harold continued. Then he borrowed to recover losses. Then he lied about recovering them. Classic Richard. Failure becoming performance management. He cared more about appearing successful than actually being stable. I looked down at the polished table surface. That sounds familiar. Harold's expression softened slightly. His father raised him that way. There it was again. Generational inheritance. Not money. Emotional architecture. Richard grew up in a house where weakness became public entertainment, Harold said quietly. His father humiliated people for sport. I thought about Richard's constant need for composure. The controlled tone. The obsession with appearing rational during conflict. Maybe emotional suppression had not begun with him. Maybe he inherited survival strategies and renamed them professionalism. Harold sipped his iced tea slowly. He honestly believed protecting image protected the family. I stared at him. That sounds insane. It sounds male, Harold replied calmly. That line stayed with me. Not because it excused anything. Because it explained too much. Harold leaned slightly closer. You know why Richard liked Ryan. I didn't answer. Ryan listened without judging him. Something tightened painfully inside my chest. Because suddenly I saw it clearly. Richard trusted men emotionally in ways he never trusted women. With women he performed competence. With men he revealed fear. Middle-aged masculinity often worked that way. Wives carried emotional labor. Male friendships carried emotional permission. I looked out across the empty golf course. Did Ryan betray him? Harold hesitated. Interesting. Not denial. Consideration. I think Ryan believed he was helping. Helping who? Depends which month you ask about. That answer chilled me. Harold reached into his coat pocket slowly and removed a folded piece of paper. Old. Creased. He slid it across the table toward me. Richard left this with me 2 weeks ago. My pulse slowed. Why? He said if things became ugly, you deserved context. Context. Not truth. Even now, Richard used emotionally cautious language. I unfolded the paper carefully. Richard's handwriting. Sharp. Controlled. If Claire ever sees this, tell her I never wanted Ben to watch me collapse. I stopped breathing normally for a second. Harold looked away politely. Giving grief privacy. An old-fashioned kindness. Below the sentence was another line. I couldn't let Mercer ruin all of us. Mercer. Ryan. I looked up immediately. What does this mean? Harold rubbed his jaw slowly. Richard thought Ryan was becoming dangerous. How? He believed Ryan started leveraging information about hidden accounts. Blackmail. Harold didn't say yes. He didn't need to. My stomach turned slowly. Because suddenly every conversation with Ryan replayed differently. His fear. His hesitation. His careful answers. I looked back down at the note. I don't understand, I whispered. Neither did Richard near the end. Harold's eyes settled on me carefully. Your ex-husband trusted people emotionally only after they already had power over him. That sounded painfully accurate. I drove home in complete silence. No music. No podcast. Just tires against wet Ohio pavement while my thoughts rearranged themselves again. The problem with discovering truth in middle age is that every answer destabilizes 10 older memories. By the time I reached my neighborhood, dusk had settled across the subdivision. Porch lights glowed softly. Children's bicycles leaned beside garages. Somewhere nearby, someone grilled hamburgers despite the cold. Normal life continuing beside emotional collapse. Ben's backpack sat near the front door when I entered. Good. Home. Safe. At least physically. I found him at the kitchen table pretending to do algebra while scrolling his phone under the workbook. A skill inherited from both parents. He looked up briefly. You eat yet? Number? I can make pasta. He nodded. Neither of us mentioned Richard. That silence felt dangerous now. While water boiled on the stove, Ben finally spoke. Did you love Dad? The question arrived so suddenly I almost dropped the wooden spoon. Yes. He looked genuinely confused by that. Even when he lied all the time. I leaned against the counter slowly. Your father wasn't lying every minute. That's not really an answer. Number. It wasn't. I looked at my son carefully. 15 years old. Already trying to understand whether masculinity automatically required emotional dishonesty. I refused to let Richard become his emotional blueprint. People can love you and still damage you, I said quietly. Ben stared down at the table. That sucks. I smiled despite myself. Yes, it really does. He hesitated, then finally asked, Are you still mad at Ryan? There it was. Children always map household tension even when adults whisper. I don't know what I am yet. Ben nodded slowly. Then looked toward the window. Ryan was nicer than Dad. That sentence hurt in a way I didn't expect. Because it was true. Ryan listened better. Showed up more consistently. Remembered emotional details Richard dismissed. And somehow betrayal from emotionally attentive men cuts deeper because they understand vulnerability before misusing it. My phone buzzed against the counter. Ryan. Again. This time voicemail followed immediately after. I stared at the screen. Then pressed play. Claire. His voice sounded exhausted. I need you to know Richard wasn't scared of prison. He was scared of humiliation. A pause. Then, and he wasn't entirely wrong about the people around him. The message ended there. No goodbye. No explanation. Just warning. I stood motionless in the kitchen while pasta water boiled over quietly behind me. And for the first time I realized this story might not actually be about money at all. It might be about what people become after shame enters the room. I found Richard at a lake cabin 2 hours north of Columbus. Not through detectives. Not through Ryan. Through a grocery store receipt folded inside one of Richard's old tax folders. Middle-aged men who spend their lives controlling financial systems rarely imagine paper receipts will betray them. The cabin sat near Buckeye Lake, behind a row of bare trees and rusted mailboxes. Late afternoon light reflected across gray water under heavy clouds. The place looked tired. Small porch. Faded siding. One pickup truck parked beside a sagging wooden fence. Not the hiding place of a criminal mastermind. Just a frightened man trying to disappear quietly. I sat in my car for almost 5 minutes before walking to the door. Not because I was scared of Richard. Because I suddenly realized this was the first conversation of our entire marriage where image no longer protected either of us. I knocked once. No answer. Then movement inside. Slow footsteps. The door opened halfway. Richard stared at me without speaking. For 1 second, neither of us looked angry. Just old. Older than the versions of ourselves we carried during the divorce. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. I almost laughed. 24 years together, and that was still his emotional opening line. "I drove 2 hours," I replied. "Move." He hesitated, then stepped aside. The cabin smelled like coffee, damp wood, and stress. Papers covered the dining table beside an old laptop and unopened cans of soup. Richard looked terrible. Not physically ruined. Emotionally uncontained. Wrinkled sweater. Unshaven jaw. The kind of disorganization successful men experience only after control collapses completely. He noticed me noticing. Embarrassment crossed his face instantly. There it was again. Not guilt. Humiliation. Always humiliation first. "You lost weight," he said awkwardly. I stared at him. "You vanished." He looked away. Fair point. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then Richard quietly asked, "How's Ben?" That question nearly broke something inside me. Not because it was sweet. Because even now he couldn't begin with accountability. He began with emotional safety. "He thinks adults lie professionally," I said. Richard sat down slowly at the table. "That's probably fair." I remained standing. I spoke to the FBI. His jaw tightened immediately. Interesting. Not surprise. Confirmation. "You should have stayed out of this." I laughed once under my breath. There was never a version where I was out of this. Richard rubbed both hands together slowly. The old stress habit. I used to watch him do that before investor dinners and school board meetings. Back when I still mistook tension for dedication. "They're building a fraud case," he admitted quietly. "How bad?" He looked toward the window. "Bad enough." "And Ryan?" A long silence followed. Then Richard finally answered. "Ryan tried to stop me at first." That complicated everything immediately. He knew about the hidden accounts. Yes. And still stayed involved. He thought he could contain it. Classic middle-aged male logic. Disaster management disguised as loyalty. I crossed my arms. "He helped you during the divorce." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." Hearing the direct admission out loud felt strangely anticlimactic. Not explosive. Just sad. "Why?" His answer came instantly. "Because I couldn't let you see me fail." There it was again. The central religion of Richard Whitmore's emotional life. Failure as exposure. Exposure as death. I sat down slowly across from him. "You really believed protecting your image mattered more than honesty." "Number." He looked at me carefully. "I believed if you saw the truth, you'd stop respecting me." That sentence landed harder than I expected. Because underneath all the control and secrecy sat something painfully ordinary. Fear. Male fear shaped by status. I thought about Ben upstairs at home learning emotional habits from all of us. Then looked back at Richard. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I don't think you ever understood the difference between respect and love." Richard looked down immediately. That hit something real. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees near the lake. The cabin creaked quietly around us. No country club. No expensive office. No audience left to perform for. Just two exhausted middle-aged people sitting inside the ruins of a carefully managed life. Richard finally spoke again. My father used to read bank statements at the dinner table. I frowned slightly. What? He'd compare incomes, investments, promotions. Richard laughed bitterly. If somebody was struggling financially, he treated them like moral failures. I stayed quiet. By 14, I understood one thing clearly. He looked at me. Men without status become invisible. The sentence settled heavily between us. Not excuse. Origin. Adults spend half their lives untangling the difference. You built your whole identity around being needed, I said quietly. Yes. And the second that cracked, you ran. His face tightened. I panicked. Finally. An honest sentence without strategy inside it. I leaned back in the chair slowly. Ryan said someone at your firm was leveraging information against you. Richard laughed softly. Someone always leverages information eventually. That doesn't answer the question. No. He looked exhausted again. It doesn't. I studied him carefully. Then asked the thing I had avoided all week. Did Ryan blackmail you? Richard hesitated too long. Not enough for certainty. Enough for damage. He crossed lines, he said carefully. That's not an answer. He became financially dependent on helping me. I stared at him. He needed money. Richard nodded once. His construction company was struggling. Cold moved through my chest slowly. Not because Ryan struggled financially. Because suddenly I understood the emotional architecture again. Men protecting pride through silence. Men helping each other maintain image while women carried emotional consequences afterward. The front door suddenly opened behind me. Both of us turned instantly. Ryan stood there breathing hard from the cold. His eyes moved from Richard to me, then to the papers covering the table. For several seconds nobody spoke. Ryan looked furious. Not aggressive furious, wounded furious. You followed me, Richard muttered. Ryan ignored him completely. His eyes stayed on me. You shouldn't have come here alone. I almost smiled. Interesting. Even now both men still framed themselves as protectors. I stood slowly from the table. No, I said quietly. I should have stopped letting men manage the truth around me years ago. Neither of them answered. Good. Ryan stepped farther inside the cabin. Snow melted from his boots onto the wooden floor. Richard leaned back in his chair looking suddenly smaller than I had ever seen him. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just tired. Ryan finally looked at him directly. You told her. Richard laughed bitterly. She already knew enough. The two men stared at each other across the room with the strange emotional tension only male friendships carry. History. Competition. Dependence. Shame. I realized then that I was watching two men who understood each other far more deeply than either ever understood me. And somehow that hurt more than the affair I once imagined. Ryan looked back at me. Claire, he said quietly, there's still something you don't know. That sentence settled into the cabin like a storm front. Because suddenly I understood this story still had one final betrayal left inside it. Ryan stood near the door with melted snow darkening the floorboards beneath his boots. Richard stayed seated at the table staring at the lake through the dirty cabin window, like he hoped distance might still save him. And I stood between them. For the first time in years, neither man controlled the room. That realization felt strangely calm. Not empowering. Just overdue. What don't I know, I asked. Ryan looked at Richard first. Interesting. Even now, male loyalty entered the room before honesty. Richard rubbed one hand over his face slowly. Tell her. Ryan exhaled hard through his nose. Then finally looked at me. The money Richard hid during the divorce. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. What about it? Ryan swallowed once. Some of it was supposed to go into a trust for Ben. The cabin went silent. Not dramatic silence. The kind where your body recognizes emotional danger before your thoughts organize. I stared at Richard. You hid money from your own son. No, Richard shook his head quickly. That's not what happened. Then explain it. His voice sounded smaller now. After the investment losses started, I borrowed against the trust temporarily. Temporarily. There was the old Richard vocabulary again. Soft words for permanent damage. Ryan stepped closer. He kept trying to recover the losses before anyone noticed. I laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because middle-aged men will gamble entire emotional ecosystems to avoid embarrassment. How much, I asked. Neither answered immediately. That told me enough. I looked at Richard. You used Ben's future to protect your image. Richard closed his eyes briefly. I thought I could fix it before it touched him. That's what every emotionally dishonest parent says. The sentence landed hard. Good. Some truths should. Outside, wind moved across the lake in low, hollow gusts. The cabin suddenly felt unbearably small. Ryan looked exhausted now, too. Older than when I first met him. Back then, I mistook emotional restraint for maturity. Now I understood restraint often hides fear. I tried to stop him near the end, Ryan said quietly. You still helped him. Yes. That honesty mattered more than excuses at this point. Richard leaned forward slowly at the table. I never wanted Ben hurt. I looked at him for several seconds, then answered carefully. The problem is you only define harm as public humiliation. He looked down immediately. Because it was true. Men like Richard survive by separating emotional damage from practical damage. As long as bills are paid, they believe love remains intact. Meanwhile, children learn silence before trust. Ryan ran one hand through his hair. The FBI doesn't know about the trust yet. I stared at him. You hid that too. I was trying to protect Ben. No, I said softly. You were trying to protect Richard from what Ben would think of him. Neither man answered. Again, good. The truth had finally become too precise to dodge. Richard stood slowly from the table and walked toward the window. His shoulders looked narrower now. Less like a provider. More like a tired, aging man who spent decades performing competence until performance became identity. I grew up believing men were only valuable when they stayed in control, he said quietly. I stayed silent. Not because I disagreed. Because I was tired of male pain arriving only after women carried consequences. Richard looked out toward the lake. My father lost money once when I was 12. His voice sounded distant now. He disappeared into his office for 3 days. My mother acted like somebody died. Ryan watched him carefully. Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. When he finally came out, he said one thing. He turned toward us slightly. In this family, failure is private. The sentence settled across the room heavily. There it was. The inheritance. Not financial. Emotional. I suddenly thought about Ben upstairs at home growing quieter every day. Watching adults edit truth in real time. Learning which emotions get hidden and which ones get protected. The cycle standing right in front of me. And for the first time since this started, I understood what actually terrified me. Not Richard's fraud. Not Ryan's betrayal. Repetition. I refused to hand this emotional blueprint to my son. Ryan spoke softly behind me. I loved you. I turned toward him slowly. The sentence sounded sincere. That was the problem. People can love you sincerely while still making decisions that destroy trust. Middle age teaches that lesson repeatedly. You loved being needed, I replied quietly. Ryan's face tightened slightly. Because that hit something true too. Richard sat back down heavily in the chair. You should take Ben and leave this behind. I almost smiled. Even now he framed emotional collapse like a logistical problem. Move. Relocate. Contain damage. I walked toward the table slowly, then placed both hands flat against the wood. No. Both men looked at me. For 20 years, the two of you managed fear by controlling information. Neither interrupted. You hid weakness. I looked at Richard. You hid failure. Then at Ryan. And you hid the truth because you thought protecting him made you honorable. Ryan looked away first. I continued quietly. And meanwhile, my son learned that men only become honest after everything collapses. The cabin stayed silent, but not empty anymore. For the first time, the silence held accountability instead of avoidance. Richard rubbed at his wedding ring finger unconsciously, even though he hadn't worn the ring in years. Habit surviving identity. What happens now? He asked finally. I thought about that carefully. Then realized something surprising. I no longer wanted revenge. Revenge would still center my life around their failures. What I wanted was distance from dishonesty. Emotional clarity. A different inheritance for Ben. You turn yourself in, I said to Richard. His jaw tightened. You tell Ben the truth yourself. Then I looked at Ryan. And you stop confusing secrecy with loyalty. Neither argued. Because deep down both already understood the damage. Outside, dusk slowly darkened across the frozen lake. The three of us stood inside the fading light, looking less like enemies and more like exhausted survivors of the same emotional system. An hour later, I drove home alone. No music. No phone calls. Just winter roads stretching quietly through central Ohio. When I pulled into the driveway, Ben was sitting on the front steps wrapped in a blanket. Waiting. I sat beside him without speaking. For a while, we just looked at the neighborhood lights across the street. Then he quietly asked, Did Dad do something bad? I answered honestly this time. Yes. Ben nodded slowly. Does he still love me? That question nearly broke my heart. Because children always ask about love before morality. Yes, I said softly. He does. Ben stared ahead at the dark street. Then why'd he lie so much? I looked up at the cold night sky above our subdivision, and finally answered the question nobody in our family had ever explained correctly. Because some people grow up believing being respected matters more than being known. Ben stayed quiet beside me, then slowly leaned his head against my shoulder. Not forgiveness. Not healing. Just honesty finally arriving before silence could inherit another generation. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to ask yourself what emotional habits your family passed down quietly, and which ones deserve to end with you.